The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road that nobody used except me and the deer. 43 winters I'd been driving up to that place. My grandfather built the original structure in 1958, and my father added the back porch the year I was born. When my wife Margaret got sick, we spent her last good summer up there. She wanted to hear the loons one more time, she said. After she passed, I kept going back. Some men go to church. I went to the cabin. That Tuesday in late October, I drove up from Asheville to winterize the place, pulled the dock, drained the pipes, covered the boats. Same routine I'd done since I was 19 years old. The drive takes about 2 hours into the Smokies, and I had a thermos of coffee and the sandwich my neighbor Rita had packed for me. I was 71 years old that fall, not as quick as I used to be, but my mind was sharp and my hands still worked. I came around the last bend before the cabin, and I saw the truck. A black Ford F-150, brand new by the looks of it, parked right there in front of my porch. I slowed down. I didn't recognize the truck. My son's car was a Subaru. My daughter-in-law drove a Honda. None of my neighbors lived close enough to walk over, and even if they did, they'd have called first. We were that kind of community. You didn't just show up at somebody's cabin in the off-season. I pulled in behind the Ford and sat in my truck for a minute. The engine ticked as it cooled. I could see footprints in the soft dirt going up to the front door. 2 sets. One was small, the other big. I got out slow. My hip was bothering me, and I leaned on the door for a second before I straightened up. I walked to the front of the Ford and looked at the license plate. Tennessee plate. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of it. I don't know what made me do that. 40 years working as a small-town district attorney, I guess. You document things. You don't think about why. You just do it because you've watched too many cases fall apart for lack of one little piece of paper. I walked up onto the porch and I was about to put my key in the lock when I heard the laugh. It was my daughter-in-law's laugh. Heather. The mother of my granddaughter. The woman my son Ben had married 11 years ago in a chapel down in Charleston. Heather was supposed to be at her sister's house this week. Ben had told me so on Sunday. He said Heather was visiting Mary in Knoxville while he took our granddaughter Sophie to Disney World. The trip had been planned for months. Sophie had a Mickey Mouse suitcase. I'd given her $200 in spending money. Then I heard a man laugh too. Low. Easy. The laugh of somebody who was comfortable. I took my hand off the doorknob. Real slow. Like I was diffusing something. I stepped back off the porch and walked around to the side of the cabin where the kitchen window was. The blinds were halfway down, but the slats were tilted open. Through the gap, I could see the kitchen table, where I'd eaten my dinner alone every weekend for the past 3 years. There were 2 coffee cups on it, a bottle of whiskey. My whiskey, the bottle I kept on top of the refrigerator. And there was Heather, sitting on the lap of a man I had never seen before in my life. He was maybe 45. Big shoulders. A close-cropped beard going gray at the chin. He was rubbing her back, and she was laughing at something he'd said, and then she leaned down and kissed him on the mouth. Slow, comfortable. Not the kiss of 2 people who'd just met. The kiss of 2 people who'd been doing this for a long time. My knees went weak, and I had to put a hand against the cedar siding to keep from going down. I'm not a man who weeps easy. I cried at Margaret's funeral, and once when Ben was born, and that was about it. But standing there at that window, I felt water in my eyes, and I felt my chest tighten up, and for a second I thought I was having a heart attack. Maybe I wished I was. It would have been simpler. I made myself breathe. I made myself take stock. I was 71 years old, a quarter mile from the nearest other house. And what I needed in that moment was not feelings. What I needed was a plan. I backed away from the window slow. I walked to my truck, and I drove a half-mile down the gravel road to the boat launch turnout where the trees would hide me. I parked there, and I sat with my hands on the wheel and my heart pounding, and I thought. The first thing I thought was, don't go back in there. Whatever the right move was, It wasn't a confrontation between an old man and a stranger half my age in an isolated cabin where nobody could hear anything. The second thing I thought was, get evidence. I had a digital camera in my glove compartment. I had bought it years ago for documenting tree damage after storms because the insurance company didn't trust phone pictures. I had also, in my bag on the back seat, a little voice recorder I used to dictate notes to myself when I was driving. Old habits. I clipped the recorder to my belt under my jacket and turned it on. Then I took the camera and I walked back through the woods. There's a deer trail that runs along the ridge behind the cabin. I'd cleared it with my own hands when I was 40. I knew every rock on that trail. I came up behind the woodshed, and from there I could see straight through the big window onto the back deck. They had moved out there. He had his arm around her, and they were drinking and talking and looking at the lake my grandfather had taught me to fish on. I took pictures, a lot of them. I zoomed in on his face, on the truck, on the way she leaned into his chest like a wife. I took pictures of him pouring her another glass. I took pictures of the way he reached up and tucked her hair behind her ear with this gesture so familiar and tender that I knew, looking through the viewfinder, that this was not new. This had been going on for a while. I stayed in those woods for almost 2 hours, just watching, just documenting. My back ached and my legs cramped up, and at one point a hornet landed on my hand and I had to sit perfectly still while it walked across my knuckles and flew off. I have never been more patient in my life. There was a thing burning in my chest, but the colder I got on the outside, the hotter it burned, and somehow that helped. Eventually he stood up and stretched. They walked back inside together, through the kitchen window. I watched her wash the 2 glasses and dry them and put them back exactly where she'd found them. He went around the living room straightening throw pillows. They were careful. They had done this before. He came out the front door first, got in his truck, backed it up, and drove off. I crouched behind the woodshed and I got pictures of his plate again, this time from a different angle, and I got pictures of his face through the windshield. About 10 minutes later, Heather came out. She locked up using a key she had on her own ring. I had given Ben that key 15 years ago. He had given it to her apparently sometime after. She got in her Honda and drove off in the opposite direction. I waited a long time before I went back to the cabin. I let myself in with my own key, and I walked through the room slow. The whiskey bottle was back up on top of the refrigerator. The coffee cups were drying upside down on a dish towel. The throw pillows on the couch were perfectly arranged. If I had not seen what I'd seen, I would have walked into that cabin and never known a thing. I went upstairs. The guest room was the only bedroom on the second floor. The bed was made, but the comforter was tucked too tight on one side and not at all on the other. The pillows on the right side of the bed were stacked like somebody had been propped up reading. There was a long blonde hair on the pillowcase, Heather's color. I stood in the doorway of that guest room, and I felt something that wasn't grief and wasn't rage, but was both and was older than both. My granddaughter Sophie had slept in that room every Christmas Eve since she was 3. She had drawn pictures of the lake with crayons that were still in the nightstand drawer, and her mother had brought a stranger up here and used the same bed where my grandbaby slept. I went back downstairs and sat at the kitchen table. I put my head in my hands, and I let myself feel it for 1 minute, exactly 1 minute, watching the second hand on the wall clock my father had hung in 1969. When the minute was up, I got up and I made myself a sandwich, and I started writing on a yellow legal pad. I knew what I was looking at. 40 years of prosecuting cases had taught me how it worked. I had seen what happened when a man found out his wife was cheating and acted on it. He yelled. He confronted her. He demanded answers. And by the time he got around to thinking about the consequences, she had already changed her story, hidden the money, called a lawyer, and turned the kids against him. By the time the divorce papers got filed, the cheater had a 6-month head start. I was not going to let that happen to my son. The first thing I did was call an old friend named Doyle. Doyle and I had worked the same circuit for 30 years. I'd been the prosecutor, and he'd been the investigator who built half my cases for me. He retired the same year I did, and now he ran a small firm out of Knoxville doing background checks and divorce work for attorneys. Doyle didn't ask questions. He never had. I gave him the plate number, I described the man, and I told him I needed everything he could find. Then I went home. I drove the 2 hours back to Asheville, and I didn't speak to a single person, and I did not cry, even though twice I had to pull over because my hands were shaking. When I got home, I made coffee, and I sat in my office, and I waited. Doyle called me back the next afternoon. The truck was registered to a man named Pierce Holloway, 46 years old. Lived in a place called Maryville, about an hour from Knoxville. Married for 19 years to a woman named Diane. 2 kids in high school, a boy and a girl. Pierce ran a small construction company that did high-end remodels and lake house builds. He had built additions and decks for several families in the area around my cabin. That's how he and Heather had probably met. Ben had hired Pierce 2 summers ago to redo the bathroom in their townhouse in Asheville. I remembered now. There had been a young construction crew at the house for 3 weeks, and I remembered Heather coming over to my house with Sophie and saying she just couldn't stand the dust. I told Doyle to dig deeper. Phone records, hotel receipts, credit cards if he could get them. I told him I'd pay whatever it cost. He said it would take a couple weeks. I said take all the time you need. 2 weeks turned into 3. Doyle was thorough. When he finally came to my house in person to deliver the file, it was the 2nd week of November, and the leaves were down off the trees. He set a manila folder on my kitchen table, and he said, "You better sit down for this one." The affair had been going on for 2 years and 4 months. Pierce had taken Heather to hotels in Pigeon Forge, Gatlinburg, Bristol, and once to Charleston for a long weekend that she'd told Ben was a sales conference. There were credit card receipts for jewelry, restaurant bills, a hotel charge from the Biltmore estate for a night that Heather had told my son she was at a friend's bachelorette party. Doyle had something else. Bank records. Heather worked part-time as a real estate agent. She made decent money, but not what Ben made. Ben was a corporate accountant with a healthy salary. He handled most of the bills, which meant Heather had a lot of room to maneuver. Over the past 18 months, she had moved nearly $60,000 out of their joint accounts in small chunks. Some had gone to a separate checking account in her name only that Ben didn't know about. Some had gone to Pierce's company, ostensibly for consulting work she had supposedly subcontracted. Some had gone straight out as cash withdrawals. I sat there at my kitchen table looking at Doyle, and I think the only thing I said for a full minute was, "My God, Pierce was in trouble too." His construction company had been on the edge for 3 years. He was leveraged on a shop building, behind on subcontractor payments, and one of his suppliers had filed a lien against him in September. Doyle's theory was that Heather had been quietly feeding him cash to keep him afloat. Whether she knew that, or whether she thought she was investing in their future together, Doyle couldn't say. I thanked Doyle and paid him, and I walked him out to his car. He stopped at the door, and he looked at me, and he said, "You all right, old friend?" And I said, "No, but I will be." And he said, "You let me know if you need anything else." And he drove off. I went back into the house, and I sat at the table with that folder in front of me for a long time. I thought about my son. Ben was 38 years old. He had Margaret's eyes. He worked too hard, and he forgave too easy, and he loved his wife the way I had loved his mother. Whole, no reservations. The kind of love that doesn't survive a betrayal because it isn't built to expect one. I thought about my granddaughter Sophie. 9 years old, she still climbed in my lap when I sat in the porch swing. She called me Pop Pop. She'd lost her grandmother when she was 6, and she'd cried at Margaret's funeral with this huge silent grief that I'd never forget. I was going to have to tell my son that his life was a lie. There was no way around it. The only choice I had was how to do it. I called another old friend. Her name was Constance, and she was the best divorce attorney I had ever known. She used to be a public defender, and we had been on opposite sides of dozens of cases back in the 80s before she went into family law. She was now in her late 60s, semi-retired, but she still took on cases that interested her. I told her I had something that might interest her. I drove down to her office in Hendersonville 2 days later. She read through Doyle's file in silence for 40 minutes. When she was done, She closed it and pushed her reading glasses up onto her head, and she looked at me. She said, "Your daughter-in-law has done your son a real favor." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "North Carolina is an equitable distribution state. Adultery on its own gets you very little. But marital misconduct involving the dissipation of marital assets, that is a different animal. She has been moving $60,000 of his money to support her affair. That is not adultery. That is fraud against the marriage. We can argue that, and we can use it for a much bigger property settlement. And the custody question, with a child involved, a pattern of deception this deep over more than 2 years gets framed as poor judgment, dishonesty, and unstable home environment. We will argue that your son should have primary physical custody. We will probably get it." She set her glasses down on the folder. She said, "But timing is everything. If she gets wind of this before he files, she will hide assets. She will coach the daughter. She will put together her own narrative. We have to move fast and we have to move quiet. Have you told your son yet?" I said no. She said, "When?" I said, "No." She said, "When?" I said, "Soon." She said, "Do not wait long. And when you tell him to call me the same hour." I drove home and I did not sleep that night. I lay in bed and I thought about how to do this. The next morning I called Ben and I told him I needed him to come over for supper that Friday. I said it was about a legal matter. I said I needed his help with some paperwork. I made it sound like nothing. He said, "Sure, Pop. I'll be there at 6. I hung up and I sat on the porch for an hour with my coffee. But before that supper, I had one more call to make. I'd been thinking about Pierce's wife, Diane. I'd been thinking about her for 2 weeks. There was a photograph in Doyle's file, a picture he had taken outside her workplace, and I had looked at it more than once. She was about my daughter-in-law's age, maybe a couple years older, brown hair pulled back, tired eyes, nurse's scrubs because she worked at a regional hospital. According to Doyle, she did 60 hours a week as a charge nurse on the cardiac floor. Pierce's late nights had been easy to explain away because she was rarely home herself. She didn't know. I thought about my Margaret. If Margaret had been alive and somebody had been doing this to her, somebody had been taking her money and her dignity and her future, and another person knew, and that other person sat on the information for their own convenience, I would never have forgiven that person. Never. Not in 100 years. I called Diane Holloway on a Wednesday morning. I had her cell number from Doyle's file. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "Ma'am, my name is Elias Whitcomb. I am calling from Asheville, North Carolina. I have something to tell you that you are not going to want to hear, and I am sorry for it, but I think you have a right to know." There was a pause, and she said, "Who is this?" I said, "My daughter-in-law has been having an affair with your husband for over 2 years. I have evidence, photographs, hotel receipts, bank records. I am sending it to you in the next hour. I am about to confront my son with the same information, and his marriage is going to end. I am calling you because you deserve to make the same choice my son is going to get to make. You deserve to know." She did not speak for a long time. I heard her breathing. I heard a hospital page in the background. Then she said, "I have been wondering for a year, and I have been calling myself crazy for a year. I have been telling myself I am paranoid." I said, "You are not paranoid." She said, "Mr. Whitcomb, send me everything." I sent her a clean copy of Doyle's file by email. Within an hour, she called me back. Her voice was a different voice than the one that had answered the phone. It was steadier, sharper, older. She said, "When are you telling your son?" I said, "Friday." She said, "Will you let me know exactly when you are going to do it? I want to do mine at the same hour. I want him to find out at the same minute she finds out. I do not want either of them to have a chance to tell the other one and get a story straight." I said, "That is exactly what I was hoping you would say." She said, "My husband is going to be at his shop on Friday until at least 7. I will go there. I will bring his brother for safety because Pierce has a temper and I am not stupid. I will do it at 6:15. I said, "I will tell my son at 6:15. She said, "Mr. Whitcomb." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Thank you." I said, "You do not need to thank me. I am sorry to be the one." She said, "No, thank you. I have 2 children who are not going to have to grow up with their mother pretending. That is worth more than I can say." We hung up and I sat with the phone in my hand and I cried for the first time since the cabin, not for myself, for her, for my son, for the children, both hers and ours, for the unbelievable mess that other people's selfishness makes of decent lives. Friday came. Ben showed up at 6 on the dot, the way he had since he was a boy. He gave me a one-armed hug at the door and asked what was for supper. I said, "Sit down at the table, son. We are not going to eat for a minute." He sat. I put a glass of bourbon in front of him without asking. I sat down across from him. Doyle's folder was in the chair beside me. I looked at my son and I said, "I have something to tell you that is going to break your heart, and I would have given anything to not be the one to say it." His face went still. He said, "What is it? Is something wrong with you? Are you sick?" I said no. "I am fine. It is about Heather." I told him about going up to the cabin. I told him about hearing her laugh through the door. I told him I had taken pictures and walked away. I told him I had hired Doyle and waited 3 weeks. He did not say a word. He sat there with his hands flat on the table, and he listened, and his face went paler and paler. I told him about Pierce, the 2 years and 4 months, the hotels, the Biltmore. I opened the folder, and I started laying things out. The credit card receipts, the pictures. He picked up one photograph of his wife on Pierce's lap, and he held it for a long time, and his hand started to shake. Then I told him about the money. I think that is the part that finally broke through whatever was holding him together. He pushed back from the table and he stood up and he walked to the window and he stood there with his back to me. His shoulders were shaking. He was crying without making any sound. I didn't get up. I let him have it. After a couple minutes, he came back to the table and he sat back down and he wiped his face with the back of his hand. And he said, "What do I do, Pop?" I said, "Son, I have already talked to Constance. You remember her. She handled your mother's estate. She is one of the best in the state. She is one of the best in the state. She is ready to take this on. We can have papers filed Monday morning. We can protect Sophie. We can protect what is left of your savings. But we have to move now." He said, "When do I confront her?" I said, "Tonight at 6:15. And that is in 8 minutes. There is one more thing. I told him about Diane Holloway. I told him she would be confronting Pierce at the same time. I told him the reason. He nodded slow. He understood. He understood because he was his mother's son, and he had a sense of fairness in him that ran deep. He said, "Where is Heather right now?" I said, "Your house." I called Mary in Knoxville yesterday, and I told her I needed her to be the one to take Sophie to the movies tonight. She agreed without asking why. She is a good woman. She loves her sister. But she loves you and Sophie too. He said, "You thought of everything." I said, "Son, I love you. I am sorry." He said, "Don't apologize, Pop. Don't ever apologize for what you did." He drove home. I sat on my porch and I watched the last light fade out of the sky, and at exactly 6:15 I imagined 2 confrontations happening in 2 different houses, an hour apart. My son walking into his living room with a folder under his arm, and a tired nurse named Diane walking into a construction shop with her brother-in-law beside her. Ben called me at 8:45 that night. His voice was calm. He said, "She is at her sister's. I told her she could come back tomorrow to get her things, and only her things. She has tried to call me 11 times. I am not picking up. Constance is ready for tomorrow." I said, "How is Sophie?" He said, "Asleep. I will tell her in pieces. Not tonight." He paused. He said, "Pop, I have to tell you something." When she finally stopped denying it, when she finally sat down on the couch and looked at me, the first thing she said was, "Who told you?" The second thing she said was it your father?" She did not ask if I was all right. She did not say she was sorry. She asked who told me. He said, "Pop, I think you saved me from 20 more years of that." I said, "I think she saved you by being who she was in the last hour when there was no point in pretending anymore. That was the truest thing she has shown you in a long time." He said, "Yeah." He said, "I love you, Pop. Thank you." The next 8 months were the hardest of my son's life and the proudest of mine. Constance was a force of nature. She filed Monday morning. She had the bank records and the receipts and the photographs in front of the judge. Before Heather had even retained her own attorney, the dissipation of marital assets argument hit like a brick. Heather's attorney tried to argue that the cabin photographs had been obtained by trespass. Constance pointed out with some pleasure that the cabin belonged to me, that Heather had no leasehold or ownership interest in it, and that I had been documenting unauthorized use of my own property. The judge agreed. The custody hearing was the hardest day. Heather got on the stand and tried to be the woman she used to pretend to be. She talked about Sophie. She cried at the right times, but when Constance laid out the timeline of the affair and asked her under oath whether she had ever taken Pierce to the cabin while my granddaughter was sleeping in the next state, she could not answer. She just sat there. Ben got primary physical custody. Heather got every other weekend, with conditions. The property settlement was lopsided in Ben's favor because the court accepted that $60,000 in marital funds had been wasted to support the affair, and that money came back to him in the form of the house and the retirement account splits. Pierce did not fare any better. Diane filed 2 days after Ben did. She got a forensic accountant to go through Pierce's books, and they found that he had been pulling cash out of the business for a year to keep himself in restaurants and hotels. The IRS got interested. So did the subcontractors who hadn't been paid. Pierce's company filed for bankruptcy in March. He moved into his brother's spare room in May. Last I heard, he was working as a foreman for somebody else's outfit. Heather moved back in with her parents in Charleston. She tried to call Ben a few times. He did not pick up. She wrote him a long letter at one point, 10 pages, and he handed it to me unopened and asked me to put it in a drawer. I put it in a drawer. It is now almost a year later. We are coming up on October again. Last week I drove up to the cabin. Ben came with me, and Sophie, Mary Heather's sister, I stayed close to the family in a way I did not expect, and she came too. We pulled the dock and drained the pipes and covered the boats. Sophie helped me sweep the porch. She is 10 now. She is taller. She has Margaret's eyes. That night, I lit a fire in the fire pit, and Sophie roasted marshmallows, and Ben sat next to me with a beer in his hand. He looked tired, but not the way he had looked a year ago. He looked tired the way men get tired when they are doing real work. Not the kind of tired the way men get tired when they are doing real work. Not the kind of tired that comes from being lied to. He said, "Pop." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I think I am going to be all right." I said, "I know you are." He said, "You went back into those woods and stood there for 2 hours with a camera." I keep thinking about that. Every time I get to feeling sorry for myself, I think about that. I said, "Son, that's what fathers do." I would have stood there for 2 days. He nodded. He watched his daughter laughing across the firelight at something the dog had done. He said, "When Sophie is old enough, I am going to tell her what you did. Not the ugly parts, just the part where you walked away from the door instead of through it. I want her to grow up knowing her grandfather's the kind of man who thinks before he acts." I didn't say anything to that, because I couldn't. I just sat there and listened to the loons out on the water. A couple weeks later, I got a card in the mail from Diane Holloway. We have stayed in occasional touch, the way two people do when they have been through something nobody else can quite understand. She wrote that she had finalized her divorce, that she was selling the house, that her son had gotten into UT on a partial scholarship, and that her daughter was applying to nursing school. She wrote, "I want you to know that the day you called me was the worst day of my life and the day I started getting my life back. I will be grateful to you for as long as I live." I put the card in my desk drawer, on top of the unopened letter from Heather, where it could outweigh it. I've thought a lot about that one phone call this past year. The call I made to Diane, not the one I made to my son. People talk about revenge like it has to be loud, like it has to involve breaking something. Mine was a phone call to a tired woman in nurse's scrubs on a Wednesday morning. That was all. I gave her information. I let her decide what to do with it. She made her own choice. Pierce paid for what Pierce did because his own wife held him to account, not because I did. That is what I learned late in life. The truth, given to the right person at the right time, does more than any fist ever could. You don't have to be the one swinging. You just have to make sure the people who deserve to know. The cabin is closed up for the winter now. The dock is in the shed. The pipes are drained. Next May, I will open it back up. Ben will come up with Sophie. Maybe Mary will come too. Maybe somebody new will be in Ben's life by then. Somebody kind, somebody worthy of him. I hope so. He is too good a man to be alone. As for me, I am 72 now. I sit on my porch most evenings with a glass of bourbon, and I watch the light come down through the dogwoods. I miss my wife. I love my son. I would walk through fire for my granddaughter, and if I had to do that whole long, terrible year all over again, every minute of it, I would do it the same way. Slower, if anything. More careful. That is what fathers do. We protect our children. No matter how old they get, no matter what it costs us, no matter how long we have to stand in the woods. I have thought about that drive up to the cabin 1,000 times in the year that followed. The thing I keep coming back to is how close I came to doing it the wrong way. My hand was on the doorknob. Another half second, and I would have walked in there and started yelling, and Heather would have called Pierce that night, and Pierce would have called his lawyer, and by the time my son Ben heard a single word about any of it, the truth would already have been buried under a pile of lies and rehearsed apologies. I would have lost the only chance I had to protect him. What stalked me was not anger and not fear. It was 40 years of watching what happens when people act on the first feeling that hits them. The world rewards the patient man more often than people want to admit. I have come to believe that real strength is almost always quiet. Loud men make a lot of noise and lose. Quiet men think and plan and wait, and when they finally move, they move once, and the matter is settled. Heather did what she did, and the consequences came for her not because I willed them to, but because she had built her whole life on a foundation that could not hold weight. You cannot lie to your husband for 2 years and 4 months and steal $60,000 from your child's future and expect that house to stand. It falls. The only question is whether you happen to be inside it when it does. She was. Pierce was too. That is not revenge. That is just gravity catching up with people who thought it would not. I think a lot about my call to Diane. That was the hardest thing I did, harder than confronting my son, because she was a stranger, and I was about to drop a bomb in the middle of a tired woman's morning. But I did it because I would have wanted somebody to do it for my Margaret. The world works better when decent people give other decent people the truth. I do not think I was being noble. I think I was just refusing to be a coward. If I have anything to pass on to my granddaughter Sophie when she is old enough to hear it, it is this. Be honest with the people who love you. They will know eventually anyway. And the longer they take to know, the more it costs everyone. Do not confuse loud with strong. Do not confuse fast with smart. When something terrible happens to you, and it will, because life saves a portion of terrible for everyone, take a breath before you act. Sit in your truck for 10 minutes. Walk away from the door. Ask yourself what you would tell a friend in your shoes, then do that thing. Ben is rebuilding. Sophie is laughing again. Diane is standing on her own 2 feet up in Maryville, and I am still going up to that cabin every October to pull the dock and drain the pipes, the same way my father did, the same way I will until I cannot anymore. That is enough. That has always been enough.